Welcome to Fort Scott National Historic Site, located in the city of Fort Scott, the county seat of Bourbon County, Kansas. Established in 1842, Fort Scott was one of several forts built along the military road in eastern Kansas, along what was then considered the permanent Indian frontier. The fort soldiers enforced peace between white settlers moving west, native tribes like the Osage and other native peoples relocated from the east. The fort was named for General Winfield Scott, who was the commander of all American armies in the 1840s. Fort Scott was home to both infantry soldiers and dragoons, elite troops trained to fight on horseback and on foot. The fort provided troops for various dragoon expeditions throughout the West, and both infantry and dragoons left the fort to support the army in the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. The army abandoned Fort Scott in 1853, and the buildings were auctioned in 1885 as the permanent frontier moved further west. Along the way on our tour, we'll learn more about some of the historic buildings that have been restored here at Fort Scott. The first building that we see on our tour is the Old Post Hospital. This building is one of the original buildings on site and served as the post hospital during the 1840s and again during the Civil War. Sick and wounded soldiers could be treated at the hospital, which was designed with the health and recovery of the patients in mind. However, due to the medical practices of the time, treatment here often impeded recovery rather than aiding it. On the second floor of the building is a hospital wardroom that's furnished as it might appear in the 1840s. The building also serves as the visitor center for the National Historic Site. Inside you can find several books related to military history, the Civil War, American Indians, African Americans, and women on the frontier, as well as learn more about the park. Before us is one of two reconstructed infantry barracks home to the infantry soldiers at Fort Scott. Called the backbone of the Army, the infantry soldiers marched into combat on foot, forming the core of the Army's fighting forces. Many were dismayed to learn upon arrival at Fort Scott that they were to be used as a glorified labor force. Using tools such as the axe and broadaxe, the infantry hand-hewn all the beams used to build this and other fort structures. Several complained that they had not joined the Army to build houses. This situation was not unique to Fort Scott, however. General Zachary Taylor stated that the axe, pick, saw, and trowel had become more the implement of the American soldier than the cannon, musket, or sword. Inside the museum, as we walk through, there is a small museum with exhibits that talk about the site's history. You'll see maps, artifacts, and various interpretive panels that tell the story of Fort Scott and its soldiers during the 1840s and onward. During the late 1850s, an era known as Bleeding Kansas, Army troops returned to Fort Scott to enforce peace between Free State and pro-slavery groups. Troops returned again during the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865, when Fort Scott served as a major supply depot for Union armies in the West. a general hospital for soldiers, and a haven for others fleeing the war-displaced Indians, escaped slaves, and farmers. The first Kansas colored infantry sworn in on the grounds of Fort Scott was one of the first African American regiments to fight with the Union Army. From 1869 to 1873, the military returned yet again to establish the post of southeast Kansas at Fort Scott to protect railroad workers from squatters who opposed the new railroad. After the Army left in 1873, the old fort building served as residences and commercial properties for many years. Eventually, some of the structures were destroyed by fire or torn down, but fortunately, federal funding made for a rebirth of the old fort possible in 1978. Fort Scott became a National Historic Site under the supervision of the National Park Service. The dragoon stables stabled the horses of the dragoons, who were soldiers trained to fight on horse and on foot. Designed to shelter 80 horses, the stables included a hayloft and granaries that stored the horses' daily ration of about 14 pounds of hay, 6 quarts of oats, and about 4 quarts of corn. A window above each stall provided the horses with ventilation, giving the horse relief and comfort during the often blistering summers here in Kansas. Tack rooms stored the equipment that enabled the horses and soldiers to function as one. Here, soldiers groomed their horses for the task of patrolling and protecting the frontier. Inside the tack room, we find where there was the care and safe storage of saddles, bridles, and other horse gear that helped assure they were in good operating condition. Our next stop on our tour is the Dragoon Barracks. Each room of the Dragoon Barracks in front of you provided the soldier with the necessities that enabled him to do his duty. The squad room gave him a place to sleep, the mess hall a place to eat, and the laundress quarters a place to get their clothes clean. Duty rosters generated at the company office kept the soldier busy during the day. In the evening, soldiers could spend free time in the barracks playing cards or checkers, engaging in the sport of boxing, reading books, or writing letters home, although the latter two activities were limited to those soldiers who were literate. Inside, we can see the mess hall. A company of soldiers ate in the mess hall. The company was divided into 4 squads of 12 privates each. One source reveals that each squad sat at its own table, hence there were 4 tables in the mess hall. By regulation, the tables in the mess hall had to be maintained to the utmost neatness. And by design and upkeep, mess halls were not only efficient, but also relatively sanitary places to serve the soldiers their meals. There is an old axiom that an army travels on its stomach. The activity that went on in the kitchen and mess hall were critical to the soldiers' health and survival. Lack of food would obviously lead to starvation, but also important was the quality of the cooking and the variety of the foods. The cast iron kettles and skillets used in open hearth and Dutch oven cooking helped assure that the food was evenly heated and cooked. The last room that we see here in the barracks is the laundress quarters. Called the Red-Armed Women of the West, laundresses scrubbed their way into history as they took on the task of keeping the Army their whitest and their brightest. The laundresses were the only officially recognized women on the post. Laundresses received 50 cents per month from each soldier she washed clothes for. Since a laundress at Fort Scott typically washed clothes for 15 men, her salary averaged about $7.50 per month. But she also received free medical services as well as rations from the commissary. Officers who had the responsibility of command received the perks that came with that position. 4 three-story duplexes were built along Officers Row that we see here, with 2 sets of quarters in each building. Typically, an officer and his family occupied half of one of these buildings. If the officer was a bachelor, he might share his quarters with other bachelors. Each of these quarters had 2 bedrooms, a dining room, and a parlor for entertainment, as well as a morning or sitting room and a kitchen. The sitting room was an informal parlor, so to speak, where the officer and his wife would have spent private time. Breakfast and lunch would generally be served here. The officer and his wife would have used this room to pursue leisurely pursuits such as watercolor painting, sewing, and reading. This was for private time only. Guests would generally not be brought down here. The kitchen is where servants prepared meals for the officers. Being from the upper class, officers and their wives had servants to perform the household chores of cooking and cleaning. Particularly in the wintertime, the servant might have slept in the kitchen adjacent to the fireplace, which would have provided warmth. In the 1840s, the servants were often African American slaves. At the time, officers from the North and the South owned slaves. The pans are made of cast iron and would have been used in open hearth cooking. The metal box in front of the fireplace was called a bird oven, used to roast quails, duck, pheasant, and other game birds that the officers would have hunted in the area. The dining room and elegant millennial china reflect the elegant lifestyle enjoyed by the officer and his wife. Officers often entertained guests here. The room was for formal dinner parties attended by other officers and their families, as well as traveling guests if they were of the appropriate social class. The parlor was the formal entertaining and social gathering area. After dinners, the ladies would go to the parlor to socialize, while the officers would meet in another room to smoke and discuss military business and politics. Afterwards, they would all meet in the parlor for games and entertainment. As we head upstairs, we'll go into the private areas of the officers. The first room that we see is a guest bedroom. If an officer and his wife had children, they would generally sleep in here adjacent to the master bedroom. Education of the children was a must among the officer class. Tutoring and schooling for children likely took place in this room. Sometimes a sergeant or corporal or a non-commissioned officer would be hired as a tutor. If there were no children, the room could be used for friends who came to visit. And then the final room we take a look at is the master bedroom. This was a room of comfort, as you can see. Beds with high posts and other elegant furnishings reflected an upper-class Victorian lifestyle. Often several different types of mattresses like straw mattresses, hair mattresses, and feather beds were layered to provide comfort. Yet the beds on the frontier likely would be lightweight to facilitate travel as officers were frequently reassigned to other posts. Located on the third floor, the bedroom window overlooks the parade ground, providing the officer with a commanding view of the fort. Here we see the post commander's headquarters. The commanding officer at Fort Scott coordinated the operation of the military post from these post headquarters that we see. He was in charge of the health, safety, cleanliness, and security of the post. He routinely dealt with housing issues, property, supplies, and personnel management. He oversaw post discipline, he could arrest other officers, and he convened court martials in this building. In these offices, he and his adjutant prepared reports and kept records that kept his superiors informed of affairs and assured the smooth functioning of the fort. In addition to the offices and court-martial room, the ordnance room and artillery shed are also attached to this building and part of the headquarters area. Discipline was rigidly enforced at army posts during the 19th century, and the commandant of Fort Scott saw that infractions of the regulations were severely punished. The enlisted men were at the mercy of the superior officers. Justice was administered by a court-martial convened here at the post in this building. A general court-martial consisted of 5 to 11 officers and had the power to try capital cases, officers, and to fine more than 1 month's pay or imprisonment of a soldier. The ordnance storeroom served as a work area and storage facility of military stores for the post ordnance officer. By Army regulations, the ordnance sergeant was to have served in the military for a minimum of 8 years. General character, fidelity, sobriety, qualifications as a clerk, and fitness of duty were required for this selection. He was responsible for 2 storage areas, the powder magazine, which is in the center of the parade ground, and this storehouse that consists of small arms, sabers, bayonets, ammunition, and small cannon. Artillery itself consisted of 2 6-pound field cannons with carriages and equipment that were supplied to Fort Scott and used from about 1845 to 1853. The evidence that has been found indicates that the cannon barrels were made of iron and very susceptible to moisture. The gun shed served as a safe storage area to protect these pieces from the harsh Kansas winters. Here we see Officers' Quarters Number 2, another building along Officers' Row. This building, which is an original officers' quarters, features many examples of the timber and frame construction that went into the creation of a permanent post. On its exterior, we can see great examples of the Greek Revival architectural features that Captain Swords, who was the architect of Fort Scott, used to build a military post that was intended to impress visitors and instill a sense of pride in those who lived here. This building served as the Quartermaster Warehouse. In this building are housed the barrels and boxes that contained those important supplies. One side is set up as the quartermaster's office and storeroom. As the name implies, the quartermaster was in charge of providing the army with quarters or buildings in which to live. In the quartermaster's storeroom are nails, paint, and other materials used in the construction and maintenance of the buildings and supplies that ultimately provided comfort to the soldiers. The commissary or subsistence officer ran the other side of the building. He used it to store food rations and other supplies vital to the soldiers' survival. Dry goods such as flour and bacon were stored in barrels and boxes, while goods that needed a cooler environment such as candles and soap, for example, were stored in a downstairs basement. Strict accountability governed the management of these supplies. Supplies were regularly inventoried. Paperwork accompanied the issuance of these supplies. Even items that were spoiled could not just be thrown out. A board of survey had to declare them unfit for consumption and order their disposal. The quartermaster, assisted by a sergeant, managed the affairs of his department in this office. All of the paperwork to order supplies was generated here, and careful records of inventory were also maintained. Proper forms had to be filled in, and quartermasters were held strictly accountable. He conducted all the inventory, even down to the last nail. Nothing could be added or removed from this building without his approval. If something went astray, that responsibility fell onto the quartermaster himself. Bread was a staple of Army life. General Winfield Scott emphasized its importance when he explained that bread was one of the great items of a soldier's diet, and to make it well and an essential part of his instruction. Scott instructed that officers will give strict attention to this vital branch of economy. The bakehouse was part of the quartermaster complex and was closely tied to both the quartermaster and subsistence departments. The quartermaster maintained the building and furnishing, while subsistence provided the flour rations and maintained the ovens. The quality of the bread was of utmost importance to the Army, but it was difficult to maintain. The Army gave no recipe for bread in the 1840s, just general guidelines, so the quality of the bread varied with the baking ability of the soldier on duty. The Surgeon General also required that bread sit for 2 days before being eaten because it was thought that fresh bread was bad for the soldier's health. Needless to say, the bread was sometimes found, well, lacking. The guardhouse in front of you served two purposes. It functioned as a jail for soldiers who had violated military laws and regulations, as well as a shelter for the guards who played a vital role in the fort's protection and security. The duties of the guards included patrolling the fort, enforcing the rules, and watching prisoners. Discipline at any post of the 1800s was very strict. Punishments were harsh and often cruel. Punishments ranged from reduction in rank, stoppage of pay, and confinement in the guardhouse for minor offenses to being whipped or confined in a choke box or solitary cells for those offenses that were more harsh. Surrounding all the buildings we have been touring today is the Fort Scott Parade Ground. This parade ground was originally enclosed by 12 buildings. The enclosed area provided some protection for the fort's water supply as well as black powder stores. The parade ground served as the U.S. Army showcase. Officers constantly sought to instill a sense of pride in the enlisted soldiers, and on these grounds that pride had to be demonstrated. Military inspections, assembly, flag ceremonies, and guard mounting that took place here were at all times soldiers were required to look top-notch and be on their best behavior. Their performance here reflected how they would conduct themselves in battle, where pride, discipline, organization, and training all combined to make the United States Army an efficient fighting force. At the center of the parade ground is this powder magazine, this octagonal building that was used to store gunpowder and other explosive materials. Totally made of brick, if there happened to be a fire outside, it would not get inside the building, or if some of the ammunition caught on fire inside, the building itself was far away from other buildings that it would not damage the entire fort. I hope you've enjoyed this Wandering Walks of Wonder tour here at Fort Scott National Historic Site. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and we will see you on our next Wandering Walks of Wonder tour. Take care now. Bye-bye.